At its peak in 1913, there were 412 million people living under the control of the British Empire, and that was nearly 25% of all the people on Earth. But with countries in the British Empire gaining independence and becoming sovereign in the aftermath of the Second World War, the size of the British Empire shrunk rapidly, going from being the largest empire the world had ever seen to almost nothing as colonization became a relic of the past. In today's world, it's almost impossible to imagine one country colonizing and maintaining control over another. But here's the thing, you don't have to imagine it, because the British Empire is still alive. It just goes by a different name. The truth is, there are as many as 14 territories outside of Britain that remain under the sovereignty and control of the United Kingdom. These territories have varying degrees of self-governance, but across all of them, the UK maintains control over their defense, their foreign relations, and their overall governance. These territories all have a British governor, and they also all have the British monarch, King Charles III, as their head of state. And their official anthem is literally, God Save the King.
God save the King.
God save the King.
But despite all of that, technically, we cannot refer to any of these territories as colonies. Why? Because a British law says so. Throughout history, territories governed by Britain were known as Crown colonies, as in colonies under the control of the British Crown. But by the 1980s, the idea of colonialism and colonies had become much less welcome in global politics. And so in the early 1980s, the British Nationality Act renamed Britain's existing Crown colonies as British Dependent Territories. But even that didn't go down too well because of the word dependent. And so in 2002, there was another renaming introduced by the British Overseas Territories Act. Colonies were no longer to be known as colonies or as British Dependent Territories. Instead, they became known as British Overseas Territories. So where exactly are all these British Overseas Territories? Just like the British Empire in its prime, these territories are spread all over the world. The closest territories to the UK are Gibraltar, a territory that's just south of Spain and is home to 33,000 people, as well as the sovereign base areas in Cyprus in southern Europe. Elsewhere, the British Virgin Islands, Montserrat and Anguilla are all just north of South America, while Turks and Caicos Islands and the Cayman Islands are around the Caribbean. In the same area, there's also Bermuda, which is just east of the United States. Meanwhile, in the global south, there's the Pitcairn Islands in the Pacific Ocean, Falkland Islands off the coast of Argentina, South Georgia and South Sandwich Islands in the Southern Ocean, and also St. Helena, which is west of Africa in the Atlantic Ocean. There's also the British Indian Ocean Territory, which, as the name implies, is in the Indian Ocean. And finally, there's the British Antarctic Territory in Antarctica. In terms of land area, these territories collectively cover 1.6 million square kilometers. However, the British Antarctic Territory in Antarctica makes up 99% of that territory. But outside of that, the rest of the overseas territories cover a land area of about 18,000 square kilometers, or about the size of Kuwait. Now, in terms of population, the majority of these territories have permanent civilian populations, which means humans live there. Except of course the British Antarctic Territory, which is too cold for anyone to live in, the South Georgia and South Sandwich Islands, which is mainly used for research, and the British Indian Ocean Territory, which is used as a military base. In total, the inhabited British Overseas Territories have a population of around 250,000 people, with the most populous territory being the Cayman Islands, with a population of about 78,000 people. So, obvious question here. What exactly is the citizenship status for people living in British Overseas Territories? The short answer is that based on current laws, residents of British Overseas Territories are also British citizens. And here's exactly how that happened. When the law to rename colonies as British Overseas Territories was passed in 2002, it also meant that citizens of British Overseas Territories became full British citizens, except for those solely connected with the sovereign base areas in Cyprus. Now, before this law was passed, only citizens of Gibraltar and the Falkland Islands were granted British citizenship automatically. But of course, that changed with the British Overseas Territories Act in 2002. Now, a former colonial power maintaining overseas territories and granting citizenship rights to residents living in those territories is pretty interesting, but it's not exactly unique. France, one of the most prominent colonial powers of the early 20th century, is another major example of this. In total, France has 13 different overseas territories spread across the world. However, one slight difference between French and British overseas territories is that French overseas territories are considered to be an integral part of France, and so they're not just described as overseas territories, they are also described simply as overseas France. For the UK, however, even though the overseas territories are considered to be a part of its sovereign territory, they are not considered to be a part of the United Kingdom itself. Now, the only reason the British Empire doesn't exist on the same scale as it did in the past is because its former colonies gained independence. After its peak in the 1920s, when the British Empire covered a quarter of all land on Earth, by 1965, the majority of former British colonies had become independent countries, free from British control. The biggest and possibly most impactful of this was India becoming independent in 1947, because India was so important to the British Empire that it was referred to as the jewel in the crown of the British Empire. So the natural question here is this: can the current British overseas territories possibly gain independence at some point in the future? The truth is, they can, but the reality is, they don't want to. In 1995, an independence referendum held in Bermuda saw 74% of all voters vote against independence and becoming a sovereign state. They chose instead to remain under British control. But this referendum only had a turnout of about 53% of the entire population. Now, a more recent and far more convincing example of this came in 2013, when a referendum in the Falkland Islands asked residents if they wanted to retain their status as a British overseas territory of the United Kingdom. This referendum saw a turnout of as much as 92% of residents, and in the end, only 3 people voted against remaining a British overseas territory. And chances are that sentiment is widely shared across other British overseas territories as well. At its peak, the British Empire was so huge it was described as the empire on which the sun never sets. But these days, we're all less dramatic in describing and thinking of the British Empire. It's not as huge as it once was, and the strong elements of colonial control have loosened considerably. But make no mistake, in a world where we all think colonialism is a thing of the long-forgotten past, the British Empire continues to exist, hiding in plain sight. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this, then please give the video a thumbs up, as that really helps the channel, and don't forget to subscribe as well. And before you go, make sure you check out this playlist of other cool geography videos I've made on the channel. See you in the next one.